information to you, but we want this to be a discussion. We want this to be interactive because we're all members of this community. So it's not something where we're like, oh, we're here to teach you and then you leave up out of here. No, we're here to talk about these things. So we're going to put some information before you, and each of us have different perspectives. As I said, I'm Chris Witt. I'm a political science professor here at Augustana. I've been in the Quad Cities and at Augustana since 2007. And some of the focus areas of my research and my teaching end up dealing with wealth inequality in the United States. My dissertation was on the impact of the racial wealth gap on Black political participation, and I do a lot of different things with students in the community, places around the country when it comes to various issues of inequality, and sometimes even how it plays into the pipeline for the professoriate, that people who are traditionally marginalized sometimes have a harder way of even becoming professors to help the next generation. So lots of different things. Everybody will learn a little bit about each person, and I'll just quickly introduce everybody by name, and then when they start talking about some things, you know, they can tell a little bit more about themselves. My colleague, Peter Cavisto, he's in sociology here. He's one of the first people that I met when I was a new professor here, and you know, actually got to have some great chats. I remember him coming to my office and saying, hey, have you read this book? Have you done that? And I was like, thank you, sir. I feel welcome now. So now we're working together on things. Alfred Ramirez, he's held many different roles here in the Quad Cities. And like I say, he's an all-around great guy. I always love talking to Alfred and doing different things with Alfred. Alfred is the former executive director of the Greater Quad Cities Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. He also was political and public relations for Group O. He has his own consulting business now, and he can tell a little bit more about himself. You've been in the Quad Cities since when?
08.
08. So we got here around the same time. And Peter, how long have you been here?
1982.
Okay, so Peter's been here a little bit longer than us. And lastly, a new friend of mine, Alicia Gomez. She works with Arrowhead. It's called Arrowhead Ranch or Arrowhead?
Income Family Service.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right. So yes, and she'll tell a little bit more about herself. But we met recently, and we've been talking about doing some different things in the community. And I think it's great to have somebody who's working on the ground level, who can talk, working with families as they try to raise the next generation while they're dealing with some of these issues. So as a team, you know, we've been communicating back and forth, and each of us have something that we want to bring to the table. The first thing that I wanted to do was just to show a couple of quick videos to you guys, just to kind of put us in the mindset of, okay, what is wealth? What is wealth inequality all about? Everybody understands what wealth is, right? So assets minus debts. A lot of times we talk about income, okay? And we think about income all the time, and we think about, well, okay, if we have generations of people, if we have people who were previously marginalized, if we could just get them to a good state when it comes to income, everything will be okay. But we forget that sometimes it takes a lot of hits to your potential for earning wealth to get to a certain income state. So let's say that you have two doctors. One doctor comes from a family that had wealth. They had property that they could mortgage to help pay for that medical school bill. They had an extra car that they could give to that person when they did their first residency, so they didn't have to pay for it. When that person was getting married, they had a few $1,000s to help start off that, you know, pay for that wedding. They had some money to help with the down payment. They have family members that aren't working ridiculous hours, that when they have children, those family members can watch the kids sometimes. And you guys know how much child care costs. You know how much down payments are for homes. You know how much it is to pay for a car, maintain a car. Then on top of that, they didn't have, like I said, they had help paying for their education, so they have less student loan debt. So their assets minus their debts is going to look a lot better than the same person who's making the same amount of money, who is their colleague as a doctor, whose family didn't have wealth. They didn't have a home that they owned that they could mortgage to help pay for things. They didn't have an extra car laying around. The family members are working well into their 70s, and they don't have time to help with the kids because they're just trying to make ends meet. There wasn't any help when there was a wedding. There wasn't any help for the down payment on the home. So much more of their income, which is the same income, is going into servicing debt. okay? So they're not having the same level of wealth, so they don't have the same cushion. They don't have the same support for a rainy day. If they get sick and can't work, if their spouse gets very sick and they need to pay medical bills, where is their safety net? The first person I talked about has a safety net. So we end up having people that could be making wonderful income, and they're a week, a month, 2 months away from poverty. Okay, so that's where poverty comes in. So even people that are making very enviable, income where everybody's looking like, wow, you make so much money, that's great. If they have all of these different debts to maintain a certain, sometimes we think about, people going into debt just to live a fancy life, but we forget, well, just to have a roof over your head, that down payment, just to pay those student loans back, just to have transportation, just to pay for, let's say you have a special needs child. I mean, there are all kinds of things that can go in. If you come from a family that has generational wealth passed down, you're going to be in a much better state, and you're going to be much further from going from the middle class into poverty, okay? And then even when we talk about people on a poverty level, sometimes we end up seeing that there are some people that have a little bit more wealth or access to the potential of wealth than others. So you have people that are making poverty income sometimes, but sometimes because they have so much other support, they can actually live a middle class lifestyle. They have support from family members. They may be living in a home they inherited. They may have a car that's given to them. All of those different things. So if we only look at income, we end up missing the big picture. One of the things that I believe, we heard a lot of talking a little while ago between David K. Johnson and Mayor Gluba, and there was a lot of good stuff. But somebody remind me, wasn't it Mayor Gluba who talked about taxing wealth, $5 million and above? Yeah. And we don't have tax structures based on wealth. It's all about what you're doing right now. And that ends up leading to problems where we really end up having that wealth past generation to generation, and people hold on to so much of the wealth in the United States, and we see more and more people at the bottom having less and less of the wealth, and fewer people at the top having more and more of the wealth, and all of that is coming at a time where politics cost a whole lot more money. So then we keep wondering why policies, why court decisions, all of these things go against this huge portion of our population. Well, big portions of the population have been taught to vote against their own interests. And they also, if campaigning and politics cost more and more money, and the masses have less and less wealth, then they have less and less of a cushion to put into those politics. So their political voice is lessened. Yes, one person, one vote, but is anybody in this room really thinking that that's all it is? That it's just a vote, that's all that matters. When we see millions of dollars spent on, let's say, the Mike Jacobs versus Neil Anderson campaign for state senate, a job that pays less than $70,000 a year, yet because of the floodgates being opened, when it comes to campaign expenditures, we see $1 million slick ads, radio campaigns, all kinds of things you never would have seen a decade ago when it comes to state senate campaigns. But we have all of this money being poured in. So what does that do to the voice of the people without wealth, without the resources to contribute? That voice is diluted. Yes, you still can knock on doors. Yes, you still can make phone calls. Yes, you can still put signs up. But does that mean the same thing when your opponents, or when both sides are having ads, that are almost Hollywood productions? So regardless of which party you decide to support, you as the regular person, a person without that wealth, your influence is diminished. So those are things that we're going to think about. And, we'll chat about a little bit more, and I'll chime in, but let me just show you these two videos. Some of you may have seen them, some of you may have not, and the rest of my colleagues have some things that they would also like to show. Hopefully our sound works.
I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly. the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
Okay, so that gives you something to think about. Okay, that should help frame what we're talking about. Now, if we add another layer, so this is Americans across the board, okay, that we have this huge and ever-growing wealth disparity in the United States of America. But if we actually lay on top of that race, it's even worse. It's even more off the charts. So a lot of my research when I was in graduate school, like I said, was on the racial wealth gap. And, you know, in my years of being a professor, I ended up being a professor. Basically, I started right before the economic downturn. I started here in 2007, and I was smart enough to buy a house in 2007. That worked out real well for me. In any case, you know, the market falls out. You know, I was sitting there crying like, no, you know, I'll never get this back. Luckily, things have started to bounce back. But in that time, in that end of 2007 through 2008 that we've all just finished living through, and you know, many of us are still, you know, trying to pick up the pieces, we ended up having before that time period the racial wealth gap or the disparity in race. Let's just use a black-white paradigm, okay? The average white family had 11 times more household wealth than their black counterparts. Now, that's not to say that there weren't, you know, white families well below zero when it came to wealth and that there weren't very wealthy black families. But when we actually look at that median, okay, when we look in there, we look at that family, we're going to end up having it be 11 times, all right? After the economic downturn, it moved up. What do you guys think it went to? What is it looking like about right now? If we were at 11 times before the economic downturn, somebody guess.
About 14 to 20.
You're closer. We're at 22 or more, so it doubled, okay, in that short period of time. And part of that was that you started having black families and Latino families for different reasons, you know, different communities with different reasons. But in the 1990s through the early 2000s, a lot of times that was new wealth that was being built. You started having black families and other families of color that were finally being able to move into the housing markets. You had them with a couple of decades of being part of the middle class and finally building up some wealth, but that wealth didn't have deep roots like some of their white counterparts in terms of generations of having homes and other things like that. So a lot more of what black families, Latino families, and other families who were new to wealth, it was a lot more volatile. So when that economic downturn hit, things went really bad. I mean, it went bad for everybody, but it went doubly bad for those families of color. So just a quick 3 minutes, and then, you know, I'll say a couple more words, and then I'll be quiet and let everybody else do their thing. But this just gives you a little...
Don't make promises you can't keep.
Yeah, yeah, I don't know if I can be completely quiet, but, you know, I'll try.
Stay with us. Stay with us.
Hi, I'm Signa Mary McKernan, economist and senior fellow at the Urban Institute. If I asked you, would you rather have over $1 million or 160,000 in 30 years, what would you choose? Now consider this. What if for every dollar you earned, someone else earned too? How about if for every dollar of wealth you gained, someone else gained 6? In 1983, whites in their 30s had an average net worth of $184,000. Today, these whites, who are in their early 60s, have accumulated $1.1 million in wealth. In contrast, blacks have seen their wealth go from $54,000 to $161,000, and Hispanics from $46,000 to $226,000. The racial wealth gap grows sharply with age. Over the past 3 decades, wealth disparities continue to worsen. Though the United States is one of the wealthiest countries, to many Americans this prosperity remains out of reach. Blacks and Hispanics, who strive to make a better life for themselves and their families, do not have the same asset building opportunities. They are less likely to own homes and retirement accounts, so miss out on these traditionally powerful wealth builders. Setting up automated savings drawn from your income allows you to build wealth through education, your home, or your retirement savings. Lack of assets, on the other hand, means a difficult life. When a rainy day hits, you're unable to pay bills and don't have enough food to eat. Our social safety net targets the day-to-day costs of living, but without fair policies, such paths to building wealth vanish. Today, these avenues are harder to access because it's tougher to qualify for home loans. To make matters worse, wealth disparities are passed from generation to generation. Black and Hispanic families are 5 times less likely than white families to inherit money that can help with down payments on a home. In order to narrow the racial wealth gap, we need to lower the barriers to building assets. Here's where things stand. In 2009, over half the $400 billion the federal government spent encouraging families to build assets went to the top 5% of income earners. Meanwhile, low-income families received next to nothing. Now imagine you have the same opportunity to earn income and gain financial security as anyone else. If that's the course we want to set, wealth is where the economic opportunity lies.
All right. So before I'm, gonna sit down, we've talked about this whole idea of wealth inequality and how it's been growing for everyone in the United States. And then we look at particular communities, especially communities of color, Black and Latino communities, how it's even worse because you don't have those deep roots. You don't have that same safety net to help your personal safety net, to help people when those rainy days come. And we've been living through a national rainy day, for the last few years. So that's something for us to consider, that when we look at our neighbors and when we think about political voice, that some people, because of lack of wealth, and some people, because of wealth, they have differing political voices. And you're going to have, we're talking about not only campaign contributions, but we're talking about time, connections, all kinds of things. Think about it. Think about something like law enforcement. If I'm a cop and I need to clear, a certain number, I need to lock up a certain number of people. Am I going to go to the west end of Rock Island? Or am I going to go to, the richest community in Bettendorf, let's say? If they had such thing as a Quad Cities Police Department. Why might I end up going to the west end of Rock Island? Well, there's less wealth there. There's less political voice. There's less political capital. There's going to be less resistance if I do something wrong when it comes to my job. If I go to Bettendorf, the person who I bust, maybe they are friends with a judge. They have wealth. They have access. They have people they can talk to. And that's just one of many examples when we start to layer wealth, social class, race, all of these different things that we see in our society, when they start to layer upon one another, then we end up having some people that have more of a voice and have a better way to go within our society and others that don't. And I guess to refer back to our earlier comments, it's not about pitting anyone against one another, but you need to recognize. People need to recognize if someone is putting them in a bad circumstance. We need to recognize if there are impediments to justice, be it economic justice, be it political justice, and if their impediments are there because of social class, because of race, because of wealth or lack of wealth. These things are things that we need to think about. So I'll relinquish to my colleagues. I don't know, did you want to go next, Alfred, since you had the PowerPoint? Or,
Sure.
I was just thinking since you had it, I'll bring it up. So while Alfred's getting over here, did anybody have any questions before I?
All right, well.
And what's our time frame? We're having a group?
I mean, the next thing is at 12:30.
Okay.
So I guess if we finish, you guys want to finish by like 12:20, 12:25, maybe we go
But we are
downstairs.
going to be serving some more food down there.
Okay, so you guys.
Just so we can share and have enough.
Yeah, have some time to share. Do you want me to run the PowerPoint for you?
Yeah, could you?
Okay.
I'll just leave that up there for now.
Okay.
But just to give you a little bit of my background, I was born and raised in East LA. My brother actually, Kenneth, I'm the oldest of five, Kenneth is the youngest in the family. He's visiting from Los Angeles this month. He knew the weather was going to be about the same. But we grew up poor, and like many folks didn't know it. And we had a house. I mean, not for rent, but we had somewhere to live, and we had our clothes. We would go to the Goodwill Salvation Army, so we were dressed and we were fed. I'm the product of, and most of my family, of programs: free lunch, free and reduced lunch, breakfast, Upward Bound, EEO programs. I actually couldn't have afforded to apply to college or to take the tests, SATs or ACTs, if it wasn't for those stipends or those that I got from the counselor. So yeah, and also there was a National Youth Corps when I was growing up. So I also worked for a program that was, for my benefit. So I know what it's like to not have as much as everyone else, but at the same time, really to feel like you're living in luxury because you have your necessities. That's what I thought that I'll say about myself. I've lived in different cities too. So I went from East LA to school in New York on a scholarship, having never been on a plane. And I just had my brochure. I ended up at Columbia University on a full scholarship. But my counselors had counseled me not to go anywhere, really, and just keep working or go locally. It was a student recruiter that encouraged me to go out east. And then I went to San Antonio, DC, Cedar Rapids, and now here, where my wife is from. That's what brings me to the city, to the Quad Cities. What I want to do is kind of just share some frameworks for our dialogue. And I don't think it's so easy to point to the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. There's so many shades in between, so many variations in between. The one distinction I want to make, though, is that there's such a thing as generational poverty and situational poverty. Somebody who had it and just lost it yesterday. And the difference there at times is they haven't grown up in a particular environment or have a mindset or circumstances that they've lived with throughout generations versus just losing it all from the stock market, the recession, etc. So this is not there's not much of a fine line between where you could be or where you will be. Many of you have seen what it means to be at a poverty level, and if you see there, for a one-person family household, living in poverty means that you make $11,600 a year, and so forth. And what you do is you add $4,000 for every number of people in the household. Now, we grew up poor enough so that we didn't pay income tax because we couldn't afford to. There was not much to tax. And my dad was working full time. He was a barber. He retired after 53 years of cutting hair. And that was just 3 years ago. He was charging $750 for a haircut at that point, just because that's what the community could afford. So you can imagine what he was charging all those other years. My mother worked off and on as we were moving on. So you'll see that I mean, those are astounding numbers, and sometimes people will say, how can anyone live on those numbers? And some people will, even after they retire, have to rethink, their paradigm here. The point I want to make too is that's poverty level. There's a fine line between being on poverty level and being just above it. You're not measured as poor, but you're right there. Or it changes, or you have multiple people living in the household on top of this. So you're making this money, but then how many of you have seen extended families in the household? So I just want to give you what we talk about as poverty level. So what I want to do here is just talk about, when we talk about intergenerational poverty, here in North America and the United States, how many would agree that there's a lot of emphasis on materialism and consumerism? We're a consumer society. What do we make anymore? When we look at what we're producing or manufacturing as a company. So there's a lot of emphasis on material things, having things to show or to buy. And so when we try to take an approach to poverty, we sometimes look at the material and the physical needs and try to address those issues. Is someone homeless? Does someone have a coat for the winter? Is someone needing something that's material or something that they can't afford to buy? And I think we really have to stop thinking that way for many of the solutions that we have and start looking at things holistically. So if anyone's any organization has to look at the failure that we have, to look at it in a historical or systemic mindset. In other words, our relief efforts have to look at how people have come to be 1, 2, 3, 4 generations of poverty. It's not that they're lazy. It's not that they just want that welfare check. It's not that they're going to have to keep having babies to get more welfare check. There's all these stereotypes, biases, and some ugly language and thinking around that. And you know, it doesn't belong to any one race or ethnicity or color. You see poor folks across the board who are stigmatized for being in poverty, and the blame more on them than anyone else, because if you're in this country, there's plenty of opportunity, you just need to bootstrap it. And for them, and then other people will lose patience and say, how could you possibly have 4 generations of poor folks? I mean, come on already. You know, first generation I can understand, or second generation, at first we're doing well, they lost it all. How in the world could second or third generation, fourth generation be poor? There must be something wrong with them. Okay? So any organization needs to look at generational poverty, but the far-reaching effects of poverty in a person's life, it goes beyond just having or not having money or necessities. There's so much more involved. Okay. Okay. So this is what I have found to be a better definition of poverty. And it's the lack of resources, financial, emotional, mental, spiritual, physical, support systems, and relationships or role models. That's when someone is truly living in poverty. That's what comes along with living in poverty. And I'll tell you this, just having grown up myself, like I said, we rented and we had food and we had our clothes. We even went to Catholic school. We got scholarships to go to Catholic school. They actually threw me out of public school in the first grade. The school was about maybe one block from my house. They said in the first grade that I was a discipline problem because I was asking too many questions and they didn't know what to do with me. So they said, put them in Catholic school. Yeah. So I ended up repeating the grade. I ended up going further away from my house. They actually took my name away. My name is Alfred Robert Ramirez. I was known as Bobby, my middle name, Robert. When I went to school there, they said, no, your name is not Bobby, it's Alfred. That's what it says here. So I had to repeat the grade, had to move away to school, and they took my name away, all by first grade. So that's what I'm talking about, the different things that occur, because you don't know any better. And also, I spoke Spanish. I knew Spanish up until the first grade. When my parents were speaking it in the house, they convinced my parents that we literally said that I would never amount to anything if I spoke Spanish again in this country, that speak only in English. So they spoke only in English to us, all 5 of us, throughout our years. And I had to go to school to learn Spanish, but when I got to high school, they said, no, you're in college prep, you have to learn Latin. So I took 4 years of Latin. I know 3 words, agricola, puella, and pueri, boy, farmer, and girl. Okay. So decades of oppression can't be undone through insignificant random acts of kindness. Instead, communities need to collaborate to create organized and systemic networks of life-changing relationships that work to empower, equip, and educate individuals. In other words, that clothing drive once a year, when it's cold, let's go get the coats, it's good, but it just can't be these scattered approaches. You know, and have you noticed that there's folks that feed people, there are folks that clothe people, there are people who deal with the family situations, but have we ever really watched a coalition of organizations handing out the baton to the next person? Okay, we gave them the coat. Now, can you feed them? And while you feed them, can you make sure that they're getting educated? While they're getting educated, can you make sure they're getting job training? I mean, we don't have that approach right now. And that's really, when we talk about systemic issues, we have to look at handoffs. So around our nations, generations are enslaved by the bondage of despair and a lack of opportunity, broken homes, and inequitable education. They're being restored in places, though, through caring relationships, empowering education, and opportunities to advance. So translation from what I just said a minute ago is, in certain cities and certain communities, there are real rays of hope for how people are addressing education, workforce, training, development, family issues. And it's no accident that you see situations of abuse, battered children, battered families, crime, within those pockets. And it's not always on each other; it's sometimes to each other from other members of the community. So, how many of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? You know, right? So think about it. Living in poverty, where would you be in the spectrum here? And you can see how psychological needs. Everyone has that as a priority. To be able to breathe, food, water, sex, sleep, excruciating, all the bodily, physiological sides of things. Safety, security of body, employment, resources, morality, the family, health, property. I've added some things in here. You don't always talk about work, talk about property and so forth, but I put it in the context of this conversation. Loving, belonging. Most folks, I included, you want to belong to something, somewhere, somehow. You want to be a part of a family or a community, an organization. You want to feel that you're not an island. Then we look at self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, and respect by others. The last thing is self-actualization. In other words, after all of this, that you truly can be who you are destined to be. Your talents, your initiative, your drive, your blessings, that you can be creative, spontaneous, solve problems, not be prejudiced by your thinking, and that you can accept facts, that you have the ability to reason. Well, imagine how all of this gets short-circuited and disrupted when you're living day to day, hour to hour, trying to literally get your basic needs met, or you've had them removed. Okay? Go ahead. So, here's a quote here from an economist, Joseph Stiglitz. He says here that American inequality began its upswing 30 years ago, along with tax decreases for the rich and the easing of regulations in the financial sector. We've heard that today in the morning, right? And by the way, when Wall Street crashed, do you remember everyone got their bonuses still? Because they said it was bad for morale if they didn't get their bonuses. So that's no coincidence. It's worsened as we've invested in our infrastructure, which is our education and healthcare systems and our social safety nets. So the rising inequality reinforces itself by corroding our political system and our democratic governance. And we heard that today, about the vote. What does that, and what you just said earlier, what does that vote really mean? And how can I even trickle up to make a difference if I'm not bringing the $10,000 check? And that one vote, one person gets diluted. Okay? So the Pope says, as long as the problems of the poor are not radically resolved by rejecting the absolute autonomy of markets and financial speculation, and by attacking the structural causes of inequality, no solution will be found for the world's problems, or for that matter, to any problems. So basically, if we can't really address these issues of poverty, inequity, generational poverty, how are we ever going to address the other issues if we can't even get past that point? If we can't feed our folks and educate them and have them reach their full potential, how are we going to grow a society? Okay. So the last thing I just want to say on all that is, how many have heard this phrase or have felt it? You ask poor folks of any background what they want to be when they grow up. They could be in third grade, first grade, kindergarten. How many of you have seen kids just have all these dreams? Astronaut, a teacher, the lawyer, operate a jackhammer, be a carpenter. They have some dream, right? They want to do and be something. So that's called high aspiration. But what happens is, as each year goes by, they end up having low expectations. Because as you ask them later, do you think you will ever achieve that dream? They'll say no. Why? Because as they begin to get older, people begin to tell them why they can't be something, why they can't do something, why they see less and less people like them being that. And so they shift from high aspirations to low expectations. And with low expectations, you will have low results. Unless by some miracle, someone pulls you out, slaps you out of it, and says, let's move, I'm with you. And that's the other thing too, how the environment can influence you so profoundly, either consciously or subconsciously. And that many people who have made it will always say there was somebody who took me under their wing. The significance or the importance of mentoring or coaching or advising. Maybe one person might be white, but African American or Latino child or in the inner city, and that they're made from different places or very similar places. You will see the magic that occurs because it doesn't know any color. A caring individual does not know any color, or class. Somebody just has taken the time to say, I'm worth something, after all these other people have not. One last story is that my counselor in high school, my fourth year math teacher, Mrs. Castle, when I came home for Christmas break, I went to Columbia University, as I said. My counselor had written my essay, his recommendation for me. I ended up being the admissions officer at Columbia for my area. So I was reading folders and had access to the files. I actually read my recommendation. And he might as well just said, the guy, he's just plain dumb and worthless and don't take him. Because it pretty much said that in a polite way. She took me to dinner, and when I got my wallet out to pay for dinner, because I enrolled her a lot as a fourth-year math teacher and counselor, she said no. She started crying, and she said, "This is Mr. Taylor, your high school counselor's paying for this." And I said, "Why are you crying? That's pretty nice." And she started crying even harder, and she said, "No, Mr. Taylor bet me dinner that you were going to flunk by Christmas and bring all your belongings back. I won the bet, and he had to pay for this." So that was the kind. I mean, I started crying because I felt so betrayed. My own high school counselor betting against me, and here I was, student body president, ran track for 3 years, 60 pounds ago. Was in student plays. I was working since I was 13, doing all the things, just trying to just do right, and being the oldest of 5. We grew up where the gang house was on our corner. Little Valley Gang was on the corner. I had two choices. Keep going to school or join the gang. And I knew once I joined the gang, my brothers and sisters would join the gang. And we would be that generation, and that next generation, gang bangers and in poverty. So even with doing everything you're supposed to achieve, this guy was betting against me because I didn't fit that model or that mold. If it wasn't for people like her, or the Upward Bound program, where I went to class at the community college on the weekends as a student, high school student, they're the ones who helped me prepare to apply and pay those fees. So there's something to be said for the influences, the mentors, and people and programs that work hand in hand to move you to the next step. So with that, I'll leave for my next colleagues, and then we can have some conversation.
Right now. I'll just stand here. I have no PowerPoint. Ray studies with me knows there's almost never PowerPoint. We've heard a lot today, and a lot of us are sort of aware of this anyway. That circa, in one of your slides, circa 1980, we start to see this major shift in the United States as levels of inequality increase. One of the things that we haven't really talked about today, though, is that with that increase in inequality, we've also had the whole discourse on issues related to inequality, the whole conversation, muted or shaped in a certain way. Okay, so one of the things that we're up against is several decades of a certain kind of discourse that has been facilitated by, and David Johnson mentioned these right-wing think tanks, facilitated by the work that they have done over the last several years. And I decided what I would try to do is identify the key features of their message on inequality and how they understand inequality. And by sheer coincidence, 2 days ago in the Wall Street Journal, I will say this, I read the Wall Street Journal, it's delivered to my house free. For some reason, it comes to my house free with my New York Times. I would never put a dime in Rupert Murdoch's pocket, but I do read the thing, okay? And there was an article titled, "What the Inequality Warriors," really want by a person named John Cochran, who's a professor of finance at the University of Chicago, and he's affiliated with the Cato Institute, precisely one of those institutes that David Johnson was talking about. Now, I will point out that it seems to me that for several decades, unless you're hanging around political science departments and sociology departments, social work programs and so on, much of the conversation about inequality has disappeared. And in fact, in political discourse, I mean, if you just listen to politicians talk. When I was a kid, one of the things that I was pretty convinced, because I'd heard this enough in the 50s and 60s, was that there were two great values in America, freedom and equality. And if you listen to political discourse today, inequality, or equality, I should say, has dropped out of the equation. It's all freedom, freedom, freedom. And it seems to be one of the then major tasks that we have, and as you think ahead to the 2016 election and so on, is to develop a kind of discourse that is a response to the right wing. And I think that a couple of things have happened that have helped make that possible. So there's a moment, but there's also a lot of thinking that has to go on in terms of how you shape that conversation and what exactly the quote message that needs to be conveyed is. But for example, I think Occupy Wall Street played a significant role in in getting the issue of inequality on the agenda. And I think, and unfortunately, the people who were the most active, people involved in that movement operated with a mistaken understanding of social movements. They decided they didn't want it to be an organization in the way conventional organizations. They didn't want to mobilize and have a permanent structure. So they, at some level, whatever happened with the Occupy movement, it kind of then fades up into the ether, But nonetheless, they did force some conversation about this. And when was it, a year or two ago, a French economist named Thomas Piketty published a huge book called Capital in the 21st Century, which I've read, but most people aren't going to read it. It's huge, And it's a very, it's well written. It's got a terrific argument. The argument is clear. It could have had an editor. There could be an abridged version that's 200 pages. But nonetheless, he has also helped. But in terms of shaping, you think of the next election cycle. Thomas Piketty is not going to be on everybody's lips. So that's not the way you frame this. I do think, I hadn't actually thought of this until your slide about Pope Francis. I think there you may have somebody who has real impact, okay? And I think something is happening there that's quite interesting. Yeah, so that, and I had not thought of that. I'm glad you had that slide there, because that, I think, might help contribute to this. But here's what I want to do. I just want to simply identify what I consider to be the 5 major points. Now, there are oftentimes more points, and I'm not suggesting that I've got them all, but I think I've got the key ones. And I can tell you this, when I read this article, all 5 of these happen to be in one way or another framed in this little article 2 days ago in the Wall Street Journal. The first one is that if there is inequality, it's not a problem. There's a rising tide raises all boats. That's the argument. The rising tide raises all boats. And so what if there's inequality? It's really not a problem. And the little clip that Chris showed looked both at, and the conversation really does have to be about the poor and about the middle class. That's another thing, by the way, in terms of political discourse. Listen to Democrats. They only want to talk these days about the middle class, not about the poor. But it is about both, and it should be. But in terms of poverty, why are people, if it really is true that a rising tide raises all boats, why is it that some people are stuck in poverty, and especially generational poverty? Why is that the case? Well, as this article makes very clear, it's because poverty is caused by, not poverty is a result. Poverty is caused by substance abuse, broken families, unemployment, and criminality. In other words, instead of those being the consequences, they are the causal agents. Okay, so this is a typical blame the poor. Blame the people at the bottom of the heap for their problem. Then the question is, however, why is it that people sort of in the middle aren't doing as well? Why is it that, for example, people with, what's the problem with skills? According to Cochrane, skilled labor is still making good money. So why is it that so many people aren't taking advantage of those jobs that are skilled? And he has a very simple answer: abysmal public schools, and of course, teachers unions. Okay, so it's an attempt to go after those, after both this public sector, this public good, public education, and in this particular article, he describes them as awful public schools dominated by teachers unions. Okay, now as it turns out, there was an article just yesterday in the New York Times that was a long-term study of factory wages, skilled work. What they were able to indicate is that over a 30-year or 40-year period, people doing essentially the same jobs at the same skill levels are getting paid roughly about half of what they were getting paid in the past. Okay, I mean, so they were interviewing a particular factory worker in Ohio who was once making $19 an hour, and now he's making $10 an hour, doing the same thing, but with for a different company, because one company closed shop and moved. Okay. Okay, so that's the third point. The fourth is this. What? Oh, you one? Well, the one is the rising tide. The other is is that
that's it.
Substance abuse and so on cause poverty. That's number two. Yeah. And then skilled people aren't getting ahead. That's the problem of public sector unions and lousy public schools. And then the fourth point is this. Those of us who complain about all this, what we are really motivated by is the politics of resentment. We're envious, we're jealous, we hate these people. The woman who stormed out downstairs, I think an example perhaps of that. So turn it on us for raising the issue. You're just
Jealous.
engaged in the politics of resentment. And that creates, yes, that's exactly right. That creates this idea of class warfare and so on. And so then finally, the solution is, certainly the solution is not more government. No, the solution is limited government and free markets. Limited government and free markets, exactly right. So those are I think the 5 points. And I think the challenge for all of us, and not just people in this room, but the challenge for progressives is to find ways to respond to this. Now some of these, for example, the issue of the rising tide, well, the evidence disproves that. I mean, the evidence disproves it. So we have facts on our side. Same thing with the issue of skills and so on. Some of these, it's easy to muster facts, but as we know, in political campaigns, Chris knows this better than anybody, I suppose, in political campaigns, facts in and of themselves don't drive results. So you have to find a way to combat these arguments and develop an articulate and convincing, and it's part of it is, I suppose, slogans, but part of it is slogans that dig deep because they have something underneath them that makes them real. Okay? So that's my message or my comments.
Guess I get to bring it home.
All right.
Well, my name is Alicia Gomez, and currently, let's see, I am a bilingual community therapist for Arrowhead Family Services. But prior to that hat that I wear, intergenerational, probably, you can just describe my whole life right there. Grew up in the west end of Moline, and currently now here in Rock Island. Let's see, put myself through school, through the public school system. Ended up at Western, put myself through school there too. The whole racial wealth gap and inequality, I see it, I lived it, I'm a recipient of it, I get it. I'm sure you guys do too. How that pertains to me in the front line, working in the service area of mental health, I see it there, it's very real. With most of my clients coming from definitely not private insurance. They get to see us through grants that we write. So we have to solicit and ask for money so we can try to provide services for them. And then once they are able to come see us, they have to decide, is my mental health important to me? Yes, it is, and I do want to come see you, but guess what? I've also got to go work my $8, $25 an 10-hour job so I can put food on the table. So what you said, Peter, it just really resonates and it brings it home with the whole substance abuse and, you know, as a result of, so the whole intergenerational poverty and the racial gap, like you said, Dr. Witt, it really, for someone who, like myself, self-disclosure here, somebody who's worked hard to get to where they're at, you know, it's, okay, so here I am, I worked hard, and I've got this money, but didn't have that nice cushion, so I've got to work even extra harder to stay at that level, and I've got to make up for all that time. It doesn't help that I have 6 kids either, so that really doesn't help. But, you know, trying to work and make a cushion for them so that they don't have to have the challenges that I have endured and am facing. I get when you say the whole mentorship. My guidance counselor wanted me to just graduate. That was his expectation. I guess I surpassed him with that now, so I can't talk to him anymore. I don't know what happened to him other than he passed away. But that was my expectation, is just graduate. And I think I surpassed it. Master's degree, that's pretty neat. Let me see what else as it pertains to intergenerational, and inequality. It's still very real. We don't have to go that far. Just walk a couple blocks down the street, either way. The west end of Rock Island, west end of Moline, same issues, same, I don't know if it's a coincidence or what it is, on this side of the river. I haven't really looked too much into Iowa because there's just like stigma of here in Illinois. You don't go into Iowa. And you know, we work hard, I'm not going to go into Iowa, but anyway, we work hard to spell that. So I guess I'm guilty. I've done it myself, but I'm working hard myself not to do that. But it is still very real. Don't go too far past your own back door, open it up, travel down a couple blocks, and there it is. It's hitting us right in the face. So as it comes to how do we make this change, I proposed to myself several years ago that I wanted to be the change in this world, one person at a time. So that has been my mantra for a while now. It's going to the different symposiums and just different, creating this awareness. I kind of walk away thinking, okay, so now information is power, and I have this information, and I have this power and this knowledge. What do I do with it? And I do it one person at a time. It begins with me. I think I've impacted my kids, especially the one who's on a presidential scholarship at Audi. Kind of put that plug in there.
Yeah. She's a sociology major.
I don't think so. Or political science. She's in between those two.
Yeah, you know, she can do both.
She is. Actually, she is. So that's kind of the beauty of it. With I think a Latin studies undergrad, but anyway. So I've impacted that change one person at a time because, like I said, I am the change I want to see in this world. And I think that's maybe the driving message that how I bring it home is it does begin with me and with you.
Thank you. All right, so we have some time for, yeah.
We're going to reconvene at 12:30.
We'll be good. They going downstairs. If the people want to talk, they can talk. We'll be
Yep.
all right.
So, questions, comments, anything? Talk to any of us, talk to the group, whatever.
Well, I think one thing that's interesting about, and I've heard this before, but I never thought of it, is that as the people in poverty, children in poverty go through school, their expectations of what they can become less. And I think I remember my first, what I wanted to be when I grew up was to be a man so I could smoke and join the army. But I got better. And as I progressed through school, my expectations got higher. And I think that generally that's true of people that have a support. So that is something that needs to be really worked on in that workshop on education over there. Because that's a real shame when they start thinking they have to lower their expectations of what they can become.
Mr. Ramirez, you said that you were poor and didn't know it. Is that right?
Yeah.
So if you look at Maslow's pyramid and you take that out of it on the bottom, because you have it listed on the base of that, then it really doesn't affect your ability to, to raise up that pyramid, right? I mean, you can still become self-actualized,
Right.
even if you don't have money.
So,
Well, it seems to me that the money is important to the people that have it. And they would like it to be important to everyone else. And apparently, I mean, it does become important to everybody else, unless you're poor and you don't know it and you don't realize that that's a negative.
right, so, yes, no, and yes. In your question or statement, or implied question. So, I grew up, so we all grew up at a point, not all equal to start with, but we have innate abilities, tools. It's just a matter of being able to self-actualize them.
Right.
So when I said I was poor and I didn't know it, what I meant by that is we were grateful for the necessities that we had, but we also knew that there were everybody around us had all kinds of other stuff. Christmas will remind you about that when folks come back and say what they got and where they got it from. So I was poor and I didn't know it, meaning that we had everything we needed to survive and to function. But institutions and individuals kept reminding me what I wasn't all along the way. I remember going with my mom to pick up the food stamps, and the woman on the other counter would have her in tears sometimes. For the attitude, the assumptions, the questions, the tone of voice. I remember people coming and patting me on the head and saying, "You're an exception to your people," supposedly a compliment because I was going to graduate. I knew we didn't have all the luxuries, but we had the necessities. But I also knew that I didn't have as much or as many of the tools as other folks did. And even early on, when I went to college, I was in a classroom with people who were reading things in 3rd and 4th and 6th grade that I was just reading at the college level. And when I went to school or class that was a required course, they had it 4 times over. So I was constantly being reminded of what I wasn't. And if I let that bother me, I probably would have just spiraled all the way down. But yeah.
Well, so that was the important lesson for you, though, wasn't it? I mean, that it wasn't really other people's opinion.
Right.
It was your knowledge of yourself, your self-actualization.
Right. Part of it too is I was always confined, and I really felt, and I'm first in to go to college, graduate, go to college, and I found I had more, and you see that with a lot of folks who don't have a mission, or I had a mission that I was going to give back, but also that I was going to give back to my family. You talk about the dollar, the minority dollar. I actually was an admissions officer, so I would go all around the high schools around the country, visiting to admit people to college. And we had a thing in the admissions office when we got in called the minority dollar, because you get grants and scholarships, and then you have self-help, what your parents can contribute and what you can contribute for a job. And so the minority dollar was different, because even if a student got scholarships or grants and was working 1, maybe 2 or 3 jobs, they're also paid for the light bill at home. They were, I would get calls from my mom saying, "Mijo, son, can you help us with the phone bill? They're going to shut off the phone." And I'm an 18-year-old freshman in school working on campus, and then back home 2 jobs in the summer. So it's a different kind of a scramble. Freshman year, I don't know,